My name is Tony Travisano, and I am taking part in an oral history for the criminal justice project, and I'm interviewing Norm Carlson today. Norm Carlson is the retired director of the Federal Bureau of Prisons, where he had a long and distinguished career. Norm, you've been in corrections for a very long time, your whole life, in fact. Why did you choose corrections?
Tony, I chose it by accident, not by design. I stumbled into the field many years ago, and I stayed with it over those, I guess, nearly 40 years. The way I got into it, as I say, was by accident. I was at the University of Iowa. I was a graduate student in sociology, and one of the requirements we had in those days, back in the 1950s, was to write a master's thesis, which was a required project. I had no idea what to write it on. I had no real thought as to what topic I might possibly choose, but I had an advisor, and he was a professor at both the School of Law at the University of Iowa as well as in sociology, and he knew the warden at the Iowa State Penitentiary and suggested I go down there and I work a summer as a correctional officer, or a guard as we were called in those days, and I based my thesis on my experiences. In other words, I'd be a participant observer at the state penitentiary and write a master's thesis on that experience. I took his advice, I did it. I went down and spent the summer there, nearly 4 months as a guard, and came back and finished up that project. The warden at the penitentiary at the time apparently liked me and liked my work and asked me to come back when I finished my degree. So I went back to the Iowa State Penitentiary. But again, I had no thought at all when I went to graduate school that I was ever going to work in prisons. It was not an aspiration or a goal of mine. It was something that I stumbled into.
What had been your desire?
I really didn't know. I started out in college as a business major. I discovered very shortly that I was not equipped, or I was not meant to be a business major. I took a course in accounting and discovered that debits and credits was not my field. So I decided to experiment a bit. I took a course in sociology. It was required, a liberal arts college. It was required to take a course in either psychology or sociology. And I took Introduction to Sociology. Why, I don't know. But that sparked a interest in mine in the field of sociology, and I pursued that in both an undergraduate degree as well as a graduate school.
You mentioned one of your professors. There was a distinguished professor at Ames by the name of London. Is that
Lundeen? Yes.
Lundeen? Is that the
Walter
gentleman?
Lundeen? No. I was at the University of Iowa.
Oh, at University.
It was Bob Caldwell, Robert Caldwell, who wrote a book called Criminology, and also he wrote a book which I just thought of now, called The Red Hannah. Hannah was the whipping post in Delaware. And he had done his graduate work at the University of Delaware and wrote a book describing Red Hannah, which was a post, and the reason it was called Red Hannah was because the blood that had dripped from the backs of these poor inmates who were being literally beaten to death colored the wood, so it was actually a wooden post. It was called Red Hannah.
That's very interesting. Talking about early corrections, what did Fort Madison look like when you went to work there?
Well, I had never been in a prison or jail before in my life, so it was a new experience for me. I didn't know what to encounter. I mean, like anybody else, the first time you're exposed to a large penitentiary. Fort Madison was a large old walled penitentiary, cell blocks 5 and 6 tiered high, the old design, telephone pole concept of a prison. The silent system, I'll never forget that. Inmates were never permitted to converse with one another except when they were working or in the cell block. Total silence in the dining room. They had to order their food, but if they wanted additional food, they would use 2 fingers for potatoes, and as I recall, meat was a raised fist and so forth. So it was a very organized, very regimented program. Staff deserved a lot of respect in those days. When an inmate saw a staff member approaching on the walk, he had to take off his hat, hold his hat over his heart, and step aside so the staff could walk by. It was, again, a very regimented form of inmate discipline in those days.
Did that system work for the, well, was it 40s, 50s?
This was in the
60s?
50s.
Yeah.
Did it work? Sure, it worked at that time. Prisons were orderly. Fights were comparatively rare. There were no riots at the time I was at the Iowa State Penitentiary. Did inmates conduct a lot of activities we didn't know about? Sure they did. There was a lot of things going on which staff didn't know about. But at the time, I think the regimen that they provided was effective.
I remember going through Fort Madison once with the warden, and we were in the mattress factory, and he kind of lifted up one mattress, and there was a deck of cards under the mattress. He went ballistic.
Yeah.
It was quite an experience to be in the penitentiary with the warden when he found some contraband.
I recall another episode there, the first time I really saw how a prison operated. They had a deputy warden who would always have a group of snitches, inmates who were informants for him. And once a week he would get canteen booklets. They didn't use cash. The inmates would buy a booklet of little coupons that they could exchange in the commissary for cigarettes or whatever they wanted, candy or ice cream. And this deputy warden would go around the cell block when the inmates were out. He would put canteen books underneath the pillows of some of the inmates who had been informants. So you could just follow him around and tell exactly who the inmate informants were in that penitentiary at the time.
Very interesting times they were. Norm, you began a long and distinguished career at the Bureau. How did you get involved with the Bureau?
Again, it's a long and a complex story, Tony. I was working at the Iowa State Penitentiary. I'd gone back after I'd finished my degree, and I was my title was sociologist. Don't ask me what a sociologist did in those days, because it was a brand new title. Essentially, I was a case manager. I interviewed the new inmates coming in. I wrote reports on them. I prepared correspondence for the warden's signature, and served in a role which today would be called a social worker or a case manager type position. At the time I was there, I enjoyed that very much, but I began to realize in those days Iowa was a very political system. The warden was appointed by the governor. All of the top staff were really appointed at the whim of the warden. There was no civil service system, no protection at all. The warden was then in his mid-60s. He was about to retire. People knew that. No one knew who the new warden was going to be, because there was about to be a gubernatorial election. So I was, in a sense, a little frustrated, and perhaps anxious was a better word. I was married at the time, no children, but I did have a wife to be concerned about. About that time, it just so happened an inmate came in, a brand new inmate, just been admitted, and I did the interview. And a very bright young guy, as I recall. He'd just gotten released from federal prison. He had served a federal sentence and was coming back now to serve another sentence that he had already accumulated in the Iowa State Penitentiary. And after the interview, he said to me, "How long have you worked here?" And I told him. And he says, "You ever worked in the federal system?" And I said, "No, I really never been in a federal prison." And he says, "Well, you ought to think about it." He said, "It's a lot better system than this is." And I said, "Well, how do you mean that?" He said, "Well, they got better staff and better equipment." And he said, "Just all around, it's a different environment." So I went home that night. I talked to my wife about it, and I said, "This guy mentioned the federal system. I've heard about federal prisons, but I had no idea what the Federal Bureau of Prisons was all about." But I wrote a letter to I guess it was the Civil Service Commission in those days. It asked what the job opportunities were, and I eventually received a letter back indicating that I would have to take a test, and if I passed that test, I would be certified, and I might be able to eventually get a job in the federal system. I did that, and long and the short, in about 4 months, I was offered a job at the U.S. Penitentiary, Leavenworth, Kansas, which I accepted. I was anxious to leave Iowa at the time and decided to accept it. So I went to Leavenworth back in 1957, I guess it was, and stayed at that penitentiary for about 2 years.
How did your wife take the move from Iowa?
She did it very well. We both realized that first of all, leaving Iowa was leaving home in a sense, because we were both from the Midwest. But, I think we recognized that the career opportunities simply were not there in Iowa. There was no opportunity really to follow through with a career plan. And if I wanted to stay in the field of corrections, I simply had to move on, find something a little more permanent in terms of employment. So that's why I left the state of Iowa. And I suspect that's why a lot of people leave various states, is because they recognize that the career opportunities simply are not there.
That's true. The Federal Bureau of Prisons has enjoyed a long stability in leadership since almost the formation of the Bureau of Prisons way back in the early 30s. You were the third or fourth director?
I was the fourth director.
You were the fourth director. Why don't you talk about the formation of the Bureau and probably tell the audience why you felt that the stability is very significant in the operation of correctional programs.
Well, the Bureau of Prisons, of course, was established back in 1930. At the time, there were 4 separate federal prisons, but they operated totally autonomously. There was no central authority. They each operated independently. They reported to the Congress independently. They received their appropriations separately. So there was no organizational entity that would coordinate all of the then 4 federal prisons. About that time, there had been several scandals in the federal prisons, the individual prisons. There was a total system of political appointees as wardens. Each warden was appointed because he in those days knew a very prominent politician, usually a congressman or a senator. And there had been several scandals involving corruption. Matter of fact, one of the wardens at Atlanta, before the Bureau of Prisons was actually established, later served time at Atlanta prison because of some financial scandals he was involved in. Anyway, the Congress decided the only solution was to centralize control and develop some mechanism by which they could ensure that the federal prison system was operating efficiently and effectively and within the law. So they established a Bureau of Prisons within the Department of Justice. The first director was Sanford Bates, who had already established a very long and distinguished career as a correctional administrator in Massachusetts. He had a long history of running good prisons, was regarded throughout the country as a very influential policymaker. He understood the mechanics of the political process, did very well in terms of relationships with the Congress and the state legislatures, and was specifically selected to become the director of the Bureau of Prisons because of his reputation, deserved reputation around the country. Well, when he came into Washington to head up the Bureau of Prisons as the first director, he had virtual carte blanche. On the Congress did not interfere at all, and he decided that the only way to run a good prison system in the long term was to develop a career system where employees were hired at the lowest levels and had opportunities to work their way up the ladder in various positions of authority. He appointed as one of his first assistant directors. This is, of course, before there was anybody in the organization, but he appointed his first director, as first assistant director, a young man from the then Bureau of Efficiency, which is the forerunner of the Office of Management and Budget in the federal government, to be his number 2, so to speak, in the organization. That was James V. Bennett. Jim Bennett had no background in corrections. He had written a report while he was a budget examiner about prisons, but had never worked in a prison, nor had he any real background in the field. But those 2 individuals, Sanford Bates and Jim Bennett, were the 2 directors who set the course for the eventual establishment of the Bureau of Prisons and for the development of a career service. It has been a career service now over all these years, and I think it's worked out very well. The Congress, I think, appreciates the fact that it's not been an organization that's been tainted with a lot of scandal, a lot of political intrigue. It's been professional, and it's operated, I think, pretty efficiently and really quite effectively. So I think that the early establishment, the way it was set up as a career service by Mr. Bates set the pattern or the model that's been followed over all these years.
It's an interesting evolution of the Bureau. And you mentioned earlier that the Bureau started with 4 different institutions. When you became the director in the early 70s?
I was appointed in 1970.
It's 1970. How many institutions did you have at that time?
There were 26 prisons at the time I became director.
And you stayed for
17 years. I retired in 1987, and there were then, when I retired, 47 or 48 prisons. So that number about doubled during my tenure, and the number of inmates about doubled. It went from 24,000 to 48,000 during that same period.
Do you have an idea how many institutions there are presently?
There's about 80 today, and there's about 100,000 inmates. So they've almost doubled again now in the last 9 years. So it took me 17 years to double the program, and now the current director has doubled it in a very short period of time. I'm being facetious. I don't mean any credit for having the doubling of the population. It's a fact of life. It happens because of changing public policy in regard to length of sentences and also to the sentencing policy of federal judges.
Very, very intriguing on how the public is viewing corrections and criminal justice in the 96 at this point, and we have no idea where it might be going over the next 10 or 15 years. And it looks as if we're going to be doubling every 7 or 8 years, unless something changes. That's not on the horizon at the moment. Norm, you had, during your tenure, not only 17 years as director, but previously, you must have run into several what we call infamous prisoners, public officials, mayors, governors, congressmen, maybe even an attorney general.
Or two.
Or two. Would you like to talk about how these people were treated in a prison system and what happened to some of them?
Well, having been director for 17 years, obviously I dealt with a number of different offenders in the system, some of whom were rather well known, I'll put it, in the community at large.
Men like Jimmy Hoffa, who was perhaps the best known labor leader of all time in our country, spent some time in custody while I was director. I actually came in before I was director, but stayed during my tenure as director, and was later, of course, pardoned by President Nixon. Yes, the Attorney General who swore me in, who appointed me to my job, later became one of my charges, became an inmate in the federal system, John Mitchell, for a Watergate-related crime. I dealt with other governors and members of the state legislature, congressmen, senators, a whole panoply of very wealthy and influential individuals. But that's part of the job. You deal with whoever the judges send you, and you do the very best you can with them. Insofar as the charge of preferential treatment, it's strictly hogwash. It never occurred. White-collar offenders are handled, or I shouldn't say white-collar offenders. Offenders of notoriety are handled a little different than any other offender. If their prior record is insignificant, which it generally is, if they're not an escape risk, if they're not a threat to society, have no histories of violence, which most of them do not, they're handled like any other minimum security offender, not because of who they are, but because of their background. They're classified appropriately for minimum security, so they go to a camp to serve their sentence. But that doesn't mean they're being sent to a camp because of who they are, but rather for the lack of criminal history, the lack of violence, and the fact that they're not an escape risk.
During your tenure, you also had a person that was well known to both of us, and that was Chuck Carlson. Chuck was a colleague of mine at the university, at Brown University, and of course worked at the White House with President Nixon, and then he became a customer of corrections. And today is leading a very successful religious advocate life. Did you meet Chuck while he was in the prison system?
I never met Chuck Carlson while he was serving his federal sentence. I met him shortly after his release, and of course I've kept in contact with him since that time. When he was first released, of course, and announced that he was going to establish a prison ministry, there were a lot of skeptics who felt that he was just trying to regain his name and was going to try to use the ministry as a means of reestablishing himself. I think people felt that he would do this for several years and then go on to bigger and better things and forget about his newfound commitment to prison ministry. That has not happened. He's held steady, he's held firm, and I think anybody who doubted his sincerity at the time of his release would have to say today that the man was sincere. I think he's done a very creditable job of developing a first-rate prison ministry program that has helped many inmates over the years, both federal as well as state and local.
He has a worldwide ministry now and travels extensively. And I think he's done a remarkable job for almost 22 years, I think.
22 years, right?
Yeah, 23. During your tenure also, we had a very significant organization come into being, which is called the National Institute of Corrections. It was formed in 1974 and became a part of the Bureau, so to speak. And I know you had a great part in putting that together in Congress. Why don't you talk about that for a minute, how effective NIC has been for the past 22 years?
Well, maybe I ought to put it in context of the organization, how it was established. First of all, a watershed in correctional history was the tragedy at Attica. As you recall, 43 or 44 staff and inmates were killed during a very tragic prison riot at the Attica State Penitentiary back in 1971, as I recall. And immediately thereafter, the public and the Congress and the media discovered prisons. There were problems in prison. Before that, for probably 10 years, there had been very little attention paid to prisons. Nobody really cared much about them. There was a sensational story now and then, but certainly nothing that captured the public's imagination. Attica did, without question, capture the public's imagination. So immediately there was a lot of interest expressed not only by the media but by various legislative bodies. Senate and House the U.S. Senate and the House of Representatives both conducted extensive hearings about prison problems and what went wrong, what caused Attica to occur, what could be done to prevent it in the future. And so questions, the time was ripe, so to speak. There was a lot of interest in the subject of correctional administration. At about that same time, there was a young staff person who worked on the staff of a very distinguished U.S. Senator from Nebraska, Roman Hruska, who was chairman of the Senate Judiciary Subcommittee in charge of penitentiary matters. And Bob Kutak was the staff person's name. He came up with the notion that perhaps what the federal government should do is set up some mechanism by which they could provide assistance and support to state and local governments, but not dominate, not try to set policy, not try to set procedure, but rather to be a partner, to be of assistance. So through Bob Kutak's efforts and the effort and support of a number of individuals, I was one of them, we were able to steer through the Congress appropriate legislation that established the National Institute of Corrections. Initially, the discussion was, where should this body be located? There were arguments that it ought to be an independent agency, some arguments that were brought forward that it should be part of the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, which, as you recall, was then a very large fund-granting agency in the Department of Justice. But the majority opinion, I think, was that if NIC were established in any one of those other agencies, it would quickly be swallowed up in the bureaucracy in Washington. It would be so small that it would immediately be swallowed up, and there would be nothing left to provide continuity of support for state and local corrections. So the thought was, why not put it in the Bureau of Prisons, not as a full partner in the Bureau, but rather as an appendage, so the Bureau could provide administrative support and shielded from the political whims of the Congress, and ensure, therefore, that there would be continuity of money, of funds, of direction to the state and local governments. And I think over the years, it's proven to be a very wise decision because NIC has survived. It's seen its ups and downs in terms of the budgetary process, but by and large, I think NIC has done a very creditable job of providing assistance to state and local governments.
Do you think it has a future as we approach the year 2000? Yes,
I think NIC is here to stay. I think their recognition and part of Washington, members of Congress at least, is that NIC has proven track record of providing assistance. Limited budget, sure, what, $10 million a year, which is peanuts in comparison with government budgets generally. But I think it's used its money wisely, and I think it, because of the support it's received from the Congress, it will continue on in the future.
Well, in the last, maybe during the 90s, it began in the late 80s, there was a hardening of thought on what corrections should do and how it should treat its so-called customers and inmates, whether it's people in the community or people in institutions. There have been several things happening over the past 10 years to change the face of corrections, so to speak. Would you like to talk about a couple of these that you see from your vantage point? You're still involved almost as much as you used to be in getting around the country, being able to talk to a lot of people.
Well, public attitudes do change, and public attitudes influence public policy without question. You know, how quickly the public reacts to a story or an event, I think, does determine what the ultimate public policy will be. And there's no question that the public policy has changed dramatically since I started out in the field of corrections. When I started out, the medical model was just becoming part of our vocabulary. The notion that you could diagnose and treat criminal behavior was I think, widely accepted. I had gone through graduate school at a time when the Sutherland theories of criminology were at their height, perhaps, and the whole notion was that if we had the resources provided, we in the social sciences could correct many of the problems we have, including crime and delinquency. And I think over the years we've discovered that perhaps we didn't quite have the answers we thought we had. The public, for whatever reason, became a little disenchanted with some of the things that had gone on. and felt that they were not getting the protection that they deserved, that they desired. So the public mood has changed today. It's a very conservative mood. The mood of the public generally, I think, can be described only in terms of one of total frustration with the criminal justice process and wanting something to somehow correct the deficiencies that have existed in the system and provide greater protection for them as citizens. It presents a real problem for a correctional administrator. You know, how do you steer a course which has to be sensitive to public policy? Sure, you should be a leader, you should be out in front. I don't think anybody would dispute that. But by the same token, we've seen what happens over the years, that leaders who get too far in front of the public suddenly find themselves looking for a job elsewhere. If you want to provide a continuity of leadership, you've got to be sensitive to the mood of the public. It's a truism that I certainly subscribe to as a public administrator for my 30-year career. So it presents a challenge, it presents an opportunity. I guess the one positive thing I would say, Tony, is that the public mood does change. The pendulum swings over time, and it's happened in the past, it'll happen again in the future. For every action, there's a counteraction. And I, for one, think that the mood of the country today is very punitive, there's no doubt about that. But I think it's going to swing back. I would be willing to predict the next decade or so we'll see this pendulum swing back. Perhaps not as far as it did in the 60s when we were in an era of great optimism in this country. But I think that we will see changes in public policy respecting corrections again within the decade.
Yeah. You probably remember that I used to keep track of statistics and on the numbers and coming into corrections, and we've set a daily record since middle of 1974, that every day that's gone by we've set a new record, and now we're in excess of 1 million plus people in the business as inmates, and there's no end in sight at the moment. And all of us are hoping that perhaps there might be a turnaround. But do you see something in your crystal ball that tells you that in the next couple of 3 years or before the turn of the century, things will change?
Well, I don't think we're going to see a sudden reversal of public policy. I think we will, however, see the public, through its elected officials, become sensitive to the fact that they simply can't pay for all these prisons. You know, prisons are a very costly and expensive part of the criminal justice process. And in a time of diminishing resources available to governments at all levels, I think we're going to find legislatures, governors, and others becoming aware of the fact that they simply have to at least hold the course and not expand further, or even possibly reverse. So I think, you know, economics is eventually going to be a factor. Now, I've said that for 5 or 6 years, and so far it does not seem to be happening. Although there is one hopeful sign, and that is that the increase in prison population has been going up at a decreasing rate. As the economists like to say, the increase is at a decreasing rate, but that's significant, because I think even though it is continuing to grow, we have not seen the phenomenal rates of growth in the last 2 years that we had seen in the previous 5 years. So I think we're beginning, I think, to see the downward trend of this, you know, constant upward pressure on prison populations.
Well, we're almost at the end of the time I think we're allotted here, and I'd like to end on a positive note, Norm, as far as your future is concerned. You left the Bureau, and although you were a teacher all those years, a little different teacher than you are today. You're a professor at the University of Minnesota, and you have been for the past 6 or 7 years. What is it like teaching undergraduate students as compared to dealing with staff and inmates? Is there any difference?
Yeah, there's a number of differences. One is, when I was director, staff always accepted what I told them, regardless if they believed it or not. Students don't do that. Students will question, and that's good. It's a positive thing. No, seriously, I've had a great career. My students occasionally say, "What would you have done differently?" I'd say, absolutely nothing. You know, it's been a fascinating career. I've enjoyed every day. I've gotten up every day. I enjoyed what I did, both when I worked in the Bureau of Prisons for 30 years and for the 9 years now that I've been on the faculty. I'm an optimist. I guess I'm a perpetual optimist. I think, you know, we have made some progress in this field. I go back where it was in the 1950s when you and I started, and I think that, you know, as one look back over that period of time, you would have to conclude that we've made some progress. It's not as great as we would have liked. We've not made any gigantic inroads into the causes of crime or the treatment of offenders, but there has been slow and steady progress. I don't think we'll ever go back to the point we were in the 50s or before. So I would view my career as being a very positive thing, and I certainly have no hesitancy to say that it was a great opportunity for me personally and professionally to work in the field of corrections. Frustrated? Sure. A lot of times I was frustrated, as you were as well. But there's also some rewards. The rewards are intangible, perhaps. It's certainly not financial. You can make more money in the private sector than you could working for the government. But a good example, my teaching assistant last year at the University of Minnesota is a young PhD candidate who was a former federal inmate when I was a director. I didn't know it at the time. I came back to Minnesota, and the first year I was there, I met this graduate student who came up to me and introduced himself and asked me what I would do if he told me he's a former inmate of mine. He said, what would you do if they assigned me as your teaching assistant? I said, I'd love it. I'd love to have the opportunity to work with you. Well, he and I have hit it off, and he's been my teaching assistant, or was my teaching assistant, for close to a year and a half. A former federal inmate, did 2 years, got out, went back, got his BA degree, is now working on his doctorate. Matter of fact, I'll get his doctorate next winter, and will be an outstanding professor of criminal justice at some school. But again, I use that as an example, as an intangible reward of somebody who's, as he said, his life was turned around. He got his act together finally in prison. Sometimes prison does help some offenders. I think the mistake is that too many academicians think that prisons are always bad. And granted, prisons are bad. I'm not defending prisons. Anytime you lock a person up, deprive that person of freedom and liberty, you've done something negative to them. There's no doubt about it, and that's the intent. But sometimes I can get their attention. And this kid, he's no longer a kid, he's 30. But as he says, that time caused him to stop and think. And he saw other inmates, and he saw people doing time on life on the installment plan. And he said, hey, I don't want to do that. And he decided to get his act together. He's done that. And, again, an intangible reward. Somebody who you had no knowledge of before you went to the university, but now you become a very close friend of a person who is going to make, I think, a first-rate contribution as an academician in the future.
Well, thank you, Norm. That's a wonderful way to end an interview on such a high positive note. That kind of experience, I think, has happened to a lot of people in corrections. We don't talk about it very often, but we should perhaps do so more often. So again, thank you for the time you've taken to work on this oral history project, and we look forward to seeing the results of this at some point in the future. Thank you.